Isabella Chen had always been different from other girls her age. While her friends spent their Friday nights at clubs or movie theaters, she could be found at the old community center on 5th Street, her fingers dancing across the black and white keys of an ancient grand piano. The instrument was older than she was, probably older than her parents too, but it had a soul that newer pianos seemed to lack. At 26, Isabella had turned down more marriage proposals than most women receive in a lifetime. Her mother worried constantly, calling every Sunday to ask about her dating life. Her friends had stopped trying to set her up on blind dates after the disaster, with the lawyer who spent the entire evening talking about his sports car. Isabella just couldn't understand why she should settle for someone who didn't share her deepest passion. Music wasn't just something Isabella did for fun. It was her language, her way of speaking to the world. She had been playing piano since she was 4 years old, starting with simple nursery rhymes and growing into complex classical pieces that made grown men cry. Her apartment was filled with sheet music, some so old the pages had turned yellow, others so new the ink still smelled fresh from the printer. The community center where Isabella spent most of her evenings was a special place. Built in the 1920s, it had seen generations of children learn to play instruments, teenagers fall in love at school dances, and elderly couples renew their wedding vows. The walls were covered with photographs from decades past, and if you listened carefully on quiet nights, you could almost hear the echoes of all the music that had been played there over the years. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Isabella volunteered to teach piano lessons to kids from the neighborhood. She never charged money because she remembered what it was like to want something so badly, but not be able to afford it. Her own family had struggled when she was young, saving every penny so she could take lessons from Mrs. Rodriguez, the old woman who lived 2 blocks away and played piano at the local church. On this particular evening, the community center was hosting its annual fundraising dinner. Local business owners, politicians, and wealthy families from across the city had paid $200 each to attend. The money would go toward buying new instruments for the music program and fixing the leaky roof that had been dripping into buckets for 3 years. Isabella wasn't supposed to be there. She had planned to spend the evening at home, practicing a new piece she was learning. But her friend Lucy, who worked at the center during the day, had called her in a panic. The pianist they had hired for the evening had gotten food poisoning and couldn't perform. They needed someone to provide background music during dinner and maybe play a few songs for entertainment afterward. She arrived at the center wearing the only formal dress she owned, a simple black number she had bought for her cousin's wedding 2 years earlier. The main hall had been transformed for the evening. Round tables covered with white tablecloths filled the space, each decorated with small flower arrangements. Candles flickered softly, casting warm shadows on the walls. The old grand piano had been moved to the front of the room and polished until it gleamed. As Isabella played soft jazz standards during dinner, she couldn't help but notice the conversations happening around her. Most of the guests were discussing business deals, vacation homes, and expensive cars. A few complimented her playing, but she could tell they weren't really listening. Music was just background noise to them, something pleasant but not particularly important. After dinner, Lucy introduced Isabella to the crowd and asked if she would play a few special songs. As she began a beautiful rendition of The Way You Look Tonight, couples started dancing on the small area in front of the piano. She watched them move together, some gracefully, others not so much, and felt a familiar pang of loneliness. That's when David Montgomery approached her. David was the son of a wealthy family that owned several restaurants across the city. He was handsome in an obvious way, with perfect teeth and expensive clothes. Isabella had seen him at a few community events before, always surrounded by people who laughed a little too loudly at his jokes. "You play beautifully," David said as she finished the song. "I don't think I've ever heard that piece played with such feeling." Isabella smiled politely. She had heard similar compliments countless times before. "Thank you. It's one of my favorites. I play a little myself," David continued, straightening his tie. "Took lessons for years when I was younger. My mother insisted. Maybe we could play something together sometime." Before Isabella could respond, David's friend James joined the conversation. James was equally well-dressed and equally confident. "Dave here is being modest," James said with a grin. "He won the state piano competition when we were in high school. Show her what you can do, buddy." David waved him off, but Isabella could see he was pleased by the attention. "Oh, that was years ago. I'm probably rusty now." The conversation might have ended there, but then Mrs. Patterson, the center's director, appeared beside them. Mrs. Patterson was a tiny woman in her 70s who had been running the center for longer than anyone could remember. Despite her small size, she had a voice that could fill any room. "Isabella, dear, would you mind playing something special for our guests? Something that really shows off what our music program is all about?" Isabella nodded and returned to the piano bench. She chose Chopin's Ballad No. 1, a piece that required both technical skill and deep emotional understanding. As her fingers moved across the keys, the room grew quiet. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Even the waiters clearing dishes slowed their movements to listen. The music filled every corner of the hall, weaving between the tables and wrapping around each person like a warm embrace. Isabella lost herself in the performance, as she always did when playing something she truly loved. The notes seemed to come not from the piano but from somewhere deep inside her heart. When the last note faded away, the silence lasted for several long seconds. Then the applause began, genuine this time, not the polite clapping that had followed dinner conversation. Several people wiped tears from their eyes. Mrs. Patterson beamed with pride. David Montgomery stood frozen near the piano, his face flushed with what might have been embarrassment or determination. In that moment, watching Isabella play, he had realized something he had never understood before. There was a difference between knowing how to play piano and truly making music. What he had just witnessed was something he had never been able to do, despite all his lessons and competitions. "That was incredible," he said quietly, as Isabella stood up from the bench. "I've never heard anything like it." Isabella smiled, gathering her sheet music. Music has a way of speaking when words aren't enough. What happened next surprised everyone in the room, including Isabella herself. David Montgomery, son of one of the city's most prominent families, suddenly looked very young and very vulnerable. The confidence that usually surrounded him like expensive cologne seemed to evaporate. "I have to be honest," he said, his voice carrying across the now quiet room. "I thought I was a pretty good piano player. I thought I understood music. But listening to you just now, I realize I don't understand anything at all." The guests began to murmur among themselves, unsure what was happening. Isabella felt her cheeks grow warm with attention she hadn't asked for. David took a deep breath and looked directly into Isabella's eyes. "You said music speaks when words aren't enough. Well, I don't have the right words, but maybe music could say what I'm feeling right now." He gestured toward the piano. "If I could play something that moved you the way your music just moved all of us, would you consider giving me a chance? Would you let me take you to dinner?" Isabella blinked in surprise. She had been asked out many times before, but never quite like this. Never with music as the bridge between two people. Before she could answer, James laughed loudly from across the room. "Come on, Dave, you're not seriously going to try to impress her with chopsticks, are you?" The comment was meant as a joke, but it hit something deep inside Isabella. All her life, people had treated her music as entertainment, as something nice but not essential. They praised her playing but didn't understand what it meant to her. They saw her talent as a pleasant hobby, rather than the core of who she was. Something shifted in Isabella's expression, a hardening that David noticed immediately. She stood straighter, her chin lifting with new determination. "You want to impress me with music?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "Fine, but it has to be real music. Not some simple song you learned in childhood, not some flashy piece meant to show off. It has to come from somewhere deep inside you. It has to mean something." The room had gone completely quiet now. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their cleaning to listen. Isabella's next words would be repeated in local social circles for months to come. They would be printed in the newspaper's society section and shared on social media. They would change her life in ways she couldn't imagine. "Play something that moves my soul," she said, her voice ringing with challenge and perhaps a touch of defiance. "Play something that makes me feel what you feel, makes me understand who you really are beneath all the expensive clothes and family money. Do that and I'll marry you." The last two words came out before she could stop them. Born from years of frustration with shallow conversations and meaningless dates, she had meant to say she would go to dinner with him. Instead, she had thrown down a gauntlet that would change everything. The silence that followed was deafening. David's face went pale, then red, then pale again. Mrs. Patterson's mouth fell open. James looked like he wasn't sure whether to laugh or call for medical assistance. Isabella realized what she had said. and felt a moment of panic. But looking around the room at all the shocked faces, she also felt something else. Relief. She had finally said what she really meant. She was tired of pretending that music was just one part of her life when it was actually her whole life. She was tired of dating men who didn't understand that her piano wasn't just an instrument, but an extension of her soul. So she didn't take it back. Instead, she looked directly at David Montgomery and waited to see what he would do with the challenge she had just issued. Word traveled fast in their small city. By Saturday morning, everyone seemed to know about Isabella's bold declaration at the fundraising dinner. The local newspaper ran a small story in their lifestyle section with the headline, "Local Pianist Issues Musical Marriage Challenge." Social media exploded with comments ranging from supportive to skeptical to downright mean. Isabella's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Her mother called 3 times before 9 in the morning, alternating between pride and panic. "Mija, what were you thinking?" she asked during the 3rd call. "You can't just promise to marry someone because they can play piano." But Isabella felt surprisingly calm about the whole situation. For the first time in years, she had been completely honest about what mattered to her. If that scared people away, maybe they weren't the right people anyway. The first challenger appeared on Sunday afternoon. Isabella was at the community center as usual, practicing for her Tuesday lesson with the kids. She heard footsteps in the hallway and looked up to see a young man she didn't recognize standing in the doorway. "Are you Isabella?" he asked nervously. "I'm Thomas Wright. I saw the article about your, challenge." Thomas was maybe 22 years old, with messy brown hair and clothes that looked like he had grabbed them from his bedroom floor. He carried a violin case and kept shifting his weight from foot to foot like he was thinking about running away. "I'm not a piano player," he said quickly, "but I've been playing violin since I was 6. I thought maybe—" I mean, music is music, right? Isabella found herself smiling at his nervousness. There was something sweet about his awkward honesty. "Of course, music is music. Would you like to play something?" Thomas opened his case with shaking hands and lifted out a beautiful violin that gleamed under the community center's fluorescent lights. He tucked it under his chin and took a deep breath. What came out was technically perfect. Thomas played a Bach piece that Isabella recognized immediately. Every note precisely placed, every bow movement controlled and smooth. He had obviously spent years training. His fingers moved across the strings with the kind of muscle memory that only came from thousands of hours of practice. But as Isabella listened, she felt something was missing. The music was beautiful, yes, but it felt cold somehow. Like watching a perfectly choreographed dance performed by someone who was thinking about their grocery list. The notes were all correct, but they didn't tell her anything about who Thomas really was. When he finished, Thomas lowered his violin and looked at her hopefully. Isabella could see he knew he had played well. He probably expected praise, maybe even excitement about his technical skill. "That was lovely," Isabella said gently. "You're obviously very talented." "But," Thomas asked, his face falling. Isabella sighed. How could she explain that technical perfection wasn't the same as emotional truth? "But it didn't tell me anything about you. I heard Bach's music, but I didn't hear your music. Do you understand what I mean?" Thomas stared at her for a long moment, then carefully placed his violin back in its case. "I guess I don't," he said quietly. "I thought playing well would be enough." He left without another word, and Isabella felt terrible. She hadn't meant to hurt his feelings, but she also knew she had been right. Beautiful technique wasn't what she was looking for. The next challenger came on Wednesday evening. This time it was Richard Stevens, a local jazz musician who played at clubs downtown on the weekends. Richard was older, maybe in his 40s, with graying hair and the kind of confident smile that suggested he had never doubted himself about anything. "I heard about your little challenge," he said, sitting down at the piano without asking permission. "Lucky for you. I happen to be exactly what you're looking for." Richard launched into an impressive jazz improvisation, his fingers flying across the keys with showman-like flair. He played loud and fast, incorporating complex chord progressions and flashy runs that made the old piano sound like a completely different instrument. A small crowd of people had gathered in the hallway to listen, drawn by the energetic music. Isabella had to admit he was skilled. Richard knew jazz inside and out, and he played with the kind of confidence that came from years of performing for crowds. He threw in little flourishes and dramatic pauses, clearly trying to impress not just Isabella but everyone watching. But again, something was missing. The music was exciting and technically challenging, but it felt like a performance rather than a conversation. Richard was showing off rather than sharing something personal. He was trying to wow her with his abilities instead of letting her see into his heart. When he finished with a dramatic flourish, the small crowd applauded enthusiastically. Richard stood up and took a theatrical bow, then turned to Isabella with a grin. "So, when's the wedding?" he asked. Isabella shook her head. "I'm sorry, but that's not what I'm looking for." Richard's confident smile faltered. "What do you mean?" "That was a perfect performance. Ask anyone here." "It was technically impressive," Isabella agreed. "But you were performing for them, not playing for me. I need to hear your heart, not your resume." Richard's face darkened. "You're making a mistake, lady. You're never going to find someone who can play better than that." As he walked away, muttering under his breath about impossible standards, Isabella wondered if he might be right. Maybe she was asking for something that didn't exist. The challenges continued throughout the week. Marcus Chen, a classical composer who taught at the local university, played an original piece he had written specifically for her. It was complex and intellectually interesting, but it felt academic rather than emotional. Patricia Williams, who had studied piano in Paris, played Debussy with exquisite sensitivity, but her performance felt more like a museum exhibit than a living conversation. Each time, Isabella found herself apologizing and explaining why it wasn't quite right. Each time she saw the disappointment and sometimes anger in their faces. Some of them argued with her. Others left in hurt silence. A few made comments about her being too picky or having unrealistic expectations. By Friday, Isabella was beginning to doubt herself. Maybe the problem wasn't with their playing. Maybe the problem was with her. Maybe she was looking for something that only existed in her imagination. The story had spread beyond their city now. A regional newspaper picked it up, then a blog, then social media influencers started sharing it. Suddenly, Isabella was getting calls from reporters and messages from strangers on the internet. Some people supported her quest for true connection through music. Others criticized her for being shallow or attention-seeking. The worst part was the comments about her appearance and personality. People who had never met her felt qualified to judge whether she was pretty enough or nice enough to deserve a husband who could play music. The attention she hadn't asked for was becoming overwhelming. On Saturday morning, Isabella arrived at the community center to find a line of men stretching around the block. Some carried instruments. Others had printed out sheet music from the internet. A few had brought portable keyboards and amplifiers. Mrs. Patterson met her at the door with worried eyes. "Isabella, dear, this is getting out of hand. There are reporters here, and that man at the front of the line has been waiting since 4 in the morning." Isabella looked at the crowd and felt a wave of panic. This wasn't what she had wanted. She had made a spontaneous declaration about what mattered to her in a relationship, not issued an open invitation for every musician in the country to audition for her hand in marriage. But the men had come, and they deserved to be heard. So Isabella spent the entire day listening to one performance after another. A country singer played guitar and sang about heartbreak. A heavy metal guitarist performed a surprisingly gentle acoustic piece. A church organist played hymns that filled the old building with religious fervor. Some of the performances were beautiful. A few moved her to tears, but none of them felt like the deep personal connection she was searching for. Each musician was talented in their own way, but they were all trying to impress her rather than reveal themselves to her. As the day wore on, Isabella noticed something troubling. The men weren't just playing music for her. They were performing for the cameras and reporters who had shown up to document the spectacle. What had started as a personal challenge had turned into a media circus. The last performer of the day was Alexander Rodriguez, a professional pianist who had driven 6 hours from the state capital after seeing the story on the news. Alexander was exactly the kind of man Isabella's mother had always hoped she would marry. Successful, handsome, well-educated, and obviously wealthy based on his expensive suit and fancy car. Alexander sat down at the piano like he owned it. He adjusted the bench with the precision of someone who had performed in concert halls around the world. Then he played Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most challenging and beautiful pieces ever written for piano. The performance was flawless. Alexander's technique was beyond anything Isabella had heard that day. He played with power and passion, his hands moving across the keys like they were extensions of his soul. The music soared and dipped, whispered and roared, painting pictures and sound that left everyone in the room breathless. When he finished, the silence stretched for a full 10 seconds. Then the applause erupted, louder and more enthusiastic than anything Isabella had heard all day. Several people wiped tears from their eyes. The reporters scribbled frantically in their notebooks. Alexander stood up and walked over to Isabella with the confidence of a man who knew he had just delivered a winning performance. "I believe that should settle your challenge," he said with a slight smile. Isabella stared at him, trying to find the words to explain what was wrong with what she had just heard. The music had been beautiful, yes. Technically perfect, absolutely. Emotionally powerful, definitely. But it hadn't been personal. Alexander had played Rachmaninoff's emotions, not his own. He had demonstrated his skill rather than sharing his heart. The performance had been about showing Isabella what he could do, not about showing her who he was. "That was incredible," she said slowly. "Truly beautiful, but—" Alexander's confident expression began to crack. "But what?" "That was one of the greatest piano pieces ever written, played perfectly. What more could you possibly want?" Isabella looked around the room at all the faces staring at her expectantly. The reporters had their phones out, recording every word. The other musicians who had performed earlier were waiting to see if Alexander had succeeded where they had failed. "I want to hear you," Isabella said quietly. "Not Rachmaninoff, not Bach or Mozart or anyone else. I want to hear your music, your feelings, your story." Alexander stared at her like she had spoken in a foreign language. "But this is music," he said, gesturing toward the piano. "This is what music is. These are the greatest compositions ever created by the greatest minds in human history. Why would you want to hear some amateur attempt at composition when you could have perfection?" And there it was, the fundamental misunderstanding that had plagued every single challenger. They all thought music was about playing existing pieces well. They didn't understand that Isabella was looking for someone who used music the way she did, as a language for expressing things too deep for words. As Alexander left, shaking his head in confusion and frustration, Isabella sat down heavily in one of the folding chairs that had been set up for the audience. The reporters approached her with their microphones and cameras, asking how she felt about rejecting such an obviously talented musician. "I think," Isabella said to the nearest reporter, "that people are missing the point entirely. This was never about finding the most skilled musician. It was about finding someone who understands that music is a way of sharing your soul with another person." The reporter, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a skeptical expression, raised an eyebrow. "But surely you have to admit that what Mr. Rodriguez just played was objectively beautiful. Aren't you being a little unrealistic in your expectations?" Isabella stood up, suddenly tired of explaining herself to people who didn't understand what she was looking for. "Maybe I am being unrealistic," she said. "Maybe what I'm looking for doesn't exist. But I'd rather wait for something real than settle for something that just looks impressive on the surface." As the crowd slowly dispersed, Isabella found herself alone in the community center for the first time in days. She sat down at the old piano and placed her fingers on the keys, but for the first time in her adult life, she couldn't think of anything to play. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe she was asking for the impossible. The community center felt different after the media circus died down. The reporters had moved on to other stories, the crowds had dispersed, and Isabella was left with an uncomfortable silence that seemed to echo through the empty halls. It had been 2 weeks since the last challenger had played for her, and she was beginning to think her story was over. People around town looked at her differently now. Some with pity, others with judgment, a few with something that might have been respect. The grocery store clerk asked if she was still looking for a husband. The bank teller mentioned seeing her on the news. Even strangers seemed to know who she was, pointing and whispering when they thought she wasn't looking. Isabella tried to return to her normal routine. Tuesday and Thursday evening lessons with the neighborhood kids, weekend practice sessions at the community center, quiet dinners at home with takeout containers and sheet music spread across her kitchen table. But nothing felt quite the same as it had before. The children in her piano classes treated her like a local celebrity now. 8-year-old Maya asked if she was really going to marry someone just for playing music. 10-year-old Carlos wanted to know if he could enter the challenge when he got older. Their innocent questions made Isabella smile, but they also reminded her of how complicated her simple declaration had become. Mrs. Patterson tried to be supportive, but Isabella could see the concern in the older woman's eyes. The community center had received more attention in the past month than it had in the previous 5 years combined. Donations had increased, which was wonderful, but so had the number of curious visitors who showed up hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman with impossible standards. On this particular Thursday evening, Isabella was staying late to practice a new piece she wanted to teach to her advanced students. The center was officially closed, but she had her own key and often used the quiet after-hours time to work on challenging music without interruption. The piece she was learning was complex, a modern composition that blended classical structure with jazz harmonies. It required both technical precision and emotional interpretation, exactly the kind of challenge Isabella loved. She had been working on it for weeks, slowly mastering each section before attempting to put it all together. As she played, Isabella lost herself in the music the way she always did. The rest of the world faded away until there was nothing but her fingers on the keys and the sound filling the empty room. This was what she tried to explain to people who didn't understand her challenge. Music wasn't just entertainment or even art. It was a way of speaking directly from one soul to another. She was so absorbed in the music that she didn't notice the soft squeaking of wheels in the hallway outside. The community center's night cleaning crew started work at 9 o'clock, long after most events had ended and the building had emptied. Isabella had seen them occasionally over the years, but she rarely paid attention to the quiet people who kept the center clean and running smoothly. Tonight was different. As Isabella finished a particularly difficult passage and paused to make notes on her sheet music, she heard the squeaking stop just outside the main hall. She looked up to see a man standing in the doorway, his cleaning cart beside him, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Isabella recognized him, though she had never learned his name. He was one of the janitors who worked the evening shift, a quiet man who seemed to be around her age. She had seen him mopping floors and emptying trash cans, always working efficiently and respectfully around whatever activities were happening in the center. He was shorter than average, with dark hair that was starting to show threads of gray, despite his relatively young age. His work clothes were clean but worn, and his hands looked like they belonged to someone who wasn't afraid of hard work. There was something gentle about his face, a kindness in his dark eyes that Isabella noticed now for the first time. "I'm sorry," Isabella said, suddenly self-conscious about taking up space in the building after hours. "I know you need to clean in here. I can move to one of the smaller rooms." The man shook his head quickly. "No, please don't stop. I was listening. I hope that's okay." His voice was quiet, with an accent Isabella couldn't immediately place. There was a formality to his English that suggested it might not be his first language, but he spoke clearly and thoughtfully. "Of course it's okay," Isabella said, surprised by how nervous he seemed. "I'm Isabella, by the way. I teach piano lessons here on Tuesdays and Thursdays." "I know who you are," the man said, then quickly added, I've seen you here many times. I'm Roberto Morales." They looked at each other for a moment across the space between the piano and the doorway. Isabella found herself curious about this quiet man who had been working around her for years without them ever really talking. "Have you been working here long?" she asked. 3 years, Roberto replied. "Ever since I moved to this city." He hesitated, then added, "I've heard you play many times. When you practice late like this. The music. It's beautiful." There was something in the way he said it that caught Isabella's attention. Most people complimented her playing politely, the way they might comment on the weather, but Roberto spoke about her music like it meant something to him personally. "Thank you," she said. Do you like music?" Roberto's expression changed, becoming both sadder and more hopeful at the same time. "Yes," he said simply. "Very much." Isabella waited for him to say more, but he seemed to be struggling with something. She could see him having an internal debate, his hands gripping the handle of his cleaning cart. "The song you were playing," Roberto said finally. "It reminded me of something. Someone, actually. My sister." The words came out quietly, like he wasn't sure he should be saying them. Isabella found herself leaning forward, drawn by something in his voice. "She loved music too," Roberto continued. Back home, she was studying to be a music teacher. She played guitar and sang like an angel. He stopped talking abruptly as if he had said too much. Isabella could see pain flash across his features there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. Where was home? Isabella asked gently. Guatemala, Roberto said. We lived in a small town in the mountains. Very beautiful, but also very dangerous sometimes. Isabella waited, sensing there was more to the story but not wanting to push. She had learned from years of teaching children that sometimes the most important things came out slowly, in their own time. Roberto seemed to be debating with himself again. Finally, he spoke. We had to leave very suddenly. My sister and I, things became unsafe for our family. We were going to come to America together, start new lives. He paused, staring at something Isabella couldn't see, but she never made it. There was an accident at the border. I lost her before we could begin our new life together. The words hung in the air between them. Isabella felt her heart clench with sympathy for this man who carried such a heavy loss. She began to understand why her music had affected him so deeply. I'm so sorry, she said softly. Roberto nodded, acknowledging her condolence. It was 2 years ago now. But when I hear certain music, especially sad but beautiful music like what you play, it brings her back to me for a little while. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Isabella found herself seeing Roberto in a completely different light. He wasn't just the quiet janitor she had barely noticed. He was a man who had lost everything and was slowly building a new life in a foreign country, carrying memories of his sister and the music she had loved. What kind of music did your sister play? Isabella asked. Roberto's face brightened slightly. Everything. Traditional songs from our village, American pop songs she heard on the radio, classical pieces she learned from an old book someone gave her. But her favorite was this one song our grandmother used to sing. It was about hope and remembering where you come from even when you're far from home. As he spoke, Isabella could hear the love in his voice. This wasn't just casual appreciation for music. This was someone who understood music the same way she did, as a language for expressing the deepest parts of the human experience. Do you play any instruments? She asked. Roberto looked embarrassed. A little guitar and piano, but not very well. My sister tried to teach me before everything happened, but I was never as talented as she was. Something in Isabella's chest stirred at his words. Here was someone who didn't talk about music as performance or competition. He spoke about it as connection, as memory, as love. Would you like to try the piano? Isabella heard herself asking. I mean, just for fun. No pressure. Roberto's eyes widened with surprise. Oh no, I couldn't. This is your practice time. And I'm not good enough to play for someone like you. Someone like me? Isabella asked. You're a real musician, Roberto said. You've been on the news. You play like a professional. I just clean floors. The sadness in his voice made Isabella's heart ache. Roberto, can I tell you something? The most beautiful music I've ever heard wasn't played by professionals. It was played by my grandmother, who only knew 3 songs but played them with more love than I've heard in any concert hall. Roberto looked at her uncertainly. Besides, Isabella continued, you're not just someone who cleans floors. You're someone who understands music, someone who carries his sister's memory in every note he hears. That makes you more of a musician than half the people who played for my challenge. The mention of her challenge seemed to surprise Roberto. I heard about that, he said quietly. People at work talked about it. They said you're looking for someone who can play music that comes from the heart. Isabella nodded. That's exactly right. Roberto was quiet for a long moment, staring at the piano. The song my grandmother used to sing, he said slowly. The one my sister loved. I remember how it goes, but I've never played it for anyone else before. You don't have to, Isabella said quickly. I was just offering if you wanted to. But Roberto was already moving toward the piano, leaving his cleaning cart by the door. His steps were careful, almost reverent, like he was approaching something sacred. My sister always said music was a gift we give to each other, he said, settling onto the piano bench. She said even if we're not perfect players, we can still share what's in our hearts. Roberto's hands hovered over the keys for a moment, trembling slightly. Isabella could see how much courage this was taking. He wasn't trying to impress her or win her challenge. He was simply offering to share something precious with her. This song, Roberto said softly. It's about finding your way home, no matter how far you've traveled or how much you've lost. My sister used to say it was her favorite because it reminded her that home isn't just a place. It's a feeling you carry with you. He pressed the first key, then another. The melody that began to emerge was unlike anything Isabella had heard during weeks of challengers. It was simple, almost childlike in its structure, but there was something pure and honest about it that made her breath catch in her throat. Roberto played slowly, carefully, making small mistakes but continuing with gentle determination. The song was sweet and melancholy, with phrases that seemed to question and others that seemed to answer. Isabella could hear the mountains of Guatemala in the music, the love of a grandmother who had passed down songs through generations, the grief of a young man who had lost his sister but kept her memory alive through music. As Roberto played, Isabella realized she was witnessing something she had been searching for all along. This wasn't perfect technique or impressive skill. This was a human being using music to share the deepest parts of his soul with another person. This was what she had been trying to explain to all those challengers who had focused on playing other people's compositions flawlessly instead of revealing themselves through sound. When Roberto finished the simple song, he kept his hands on the keys for a moment, his head bowed. The silence that followed wasn't empty like the silences after technical performances. It was full of everything he had just shared: love, loss, hope, memory, and a quiet strength that came from surviving unimaginable hardship. Isabella realized there were tears on her cheeks. Not the tears that came from being impressed by technical skill, but the tears that came from being touched by genuine human emotion, expressed through music. Roberto looked up at her with worried eyes. "I told you I wasn't very good," he said apologetically. "I made several mistakes." Isabella wiped her eyes and smiled through her tears. "Roberto," she said softly, "that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Roberto stared at Isabella with complete disbelief written across his face. His hands were still resting on the piano keys and she could see them shaking slightly. For a moment neither of them spoke. The weight of what had just happened seemed to settle around them like dust after an earthquake. "You can't mean that," Roberto said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm not the kind of person you were looking for." Isabella felt her heart breaking at the pain in his voice. Here was a man who had just shared the most beautiful, honest music she had ever heard, and he couldn't even imagine that it might be enough. The world had taught him to see himself as invisible, unworthy of attention or love. "Why would you say that?" Isabella asked, moving closer to the piano bench. "Roberto, what you just played, it was everything I've been searching for." Roberto shook his head, looking down at his work clothes, his calloused hands, the cleaning cart still sitting by the door. "Look at me," he said. "Really look at me. I clean floors for a living. I live in a tiny apartment above a grocery store. I send most of my money back to my family in Guatemala because they're still struggling without my sister's income." He gestured toward the fancy clothes and expensive instruments that some of her previous challengers had brought. Those other men, they had education and money and professional training. They could offer you the kind of life you deserve. I have nothing. Isabella sat down on the bench beside him, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. This was a man who worked hard every day just to survive, who carried grief and responsibility on his shoulders like physical weights. "Can I tell you what I heard when you played just now?" Isabella asked softly. Roberto looked at her uncertainly but nodded. "I heard love," Isabella began. "Not love for me, we barely know each other, but love for your sister, for your grandmother, for the music that connects you to them. I heard someone who understands TI. Hat music isn't about showing off or impressing people. It's about sharing the deepest parts of yourself with another human being." She paused, trying to find the right words. "All those other musicians played beautifully. Some of them were incredibly talented, but they were all trying to win something from me. You weren't trying to win anything. You were just giving. Sharing something precious because you thought it might mean something to me, too." Roberto's eyes filled with tears. "It did mean something to my sister. She said that song was about finding your way to the people who understand you, no matter how different your backgrounds might be." "Smart sister," Isabella said with a gentle smile. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of possibility hanging between them. Isabella could see Roberto struggling with something, his internal battle playing out across his expressive features. "Isabella," he said finally, "I need you to understand something. I'm not just poor. I'm also complicated. My life is complicated." Isabella waited for him to continue. "I'm here without papers," Roberto said, the words coming out in a rush like he was afraid he might lose courage. "I came across the border illegally after my sister died. I was supposed to meet someone who could help me get documentation, but they disappeared with the money I paid them. So now I work jobs that pay cash and I live every day afraid that someone might report me." He looked at her with desperate honesty. "If you're seen with me, if people know we're together, it could cause problems for you, especially now with all the attention from your challenge. I couldn't live with myself if I brought trouble into your life." Isabella felt something fierce and protective rise up in her chest. Here was a man who had lost everything, who was living with constant fear and uncertainty, and he was worried about causing problems for her. "Roberto," she said firmly, "do you think I care about any of that?" "You should," he replied. "You should care. You're a respected teacher, a talented musician. You have a good life here. I don't want to complicate that." Isabella turned on the bench to face him fully. "You want to know what's complicated? Spending 3 years teaching children to love music while dating men who think piano lessons are just a cute hobby, going to dinner parties where people treat classical music like background noise, pretending to be interested in conversations about stock portfolios and vacation homes, when all I want to talk about is how a particular piece of music makes me feel." Roberto listened intently, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "What's simple," Isabella continued, "is sitting here with someone who understands that music is a language, someone who plays not to impress but to communicate, someone who knows that the most beautiful melodies often come from the deepest pain." Roberto was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands on the piano keys. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I think about my sister every day," he said. "I wonder what she would think of the life I'm building here, whether she would be proud of the man I'm trying to become." He looked at Isabella. "I think she would like you very much." Isabella felt tears welling up again. "I would have liked her too." Roberto smiled, the first real smile Isabella had seen from him all evening. "She would have loved your playing. She always said the best musicians were the ones who played like they were having conversations with invisible friends." They laughed softly at that, and some of the tension in the room began to ease. "Roberto," Isabella said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." He nodded. "When you played that song for me, were you thinking about my challenge? Were you hoping it might lead somewhere between us?" Roberto looked embarrassed. Yes, maybe a little. But mostly I was just thinking about my sister, and about how lonely I've been since she died. When I heard you playing tonight, it reminded me of how music used to feel when she was alive. Like a conversation with someone who really understood." Isabella's heart swelled. This was exactly the honesty she had been hoping for. "There's something I need to tell you too," she said. "When I made that challenge at the fundraising dinner, I was frustrated and tired of dating men who didn't understand what mattered to me. But I never expected it to become this huge public thing. I never wanted to turn finding love into some kind of competition." She gestured around the empty community center. "All those people who came to play for me?" Most of them were nice enough, but they were treating it like an audition instead of a chance to really connect with another person. "You're the first person who just talked to me through music instead of trying to impress me with it." Roberto was quiet, processing what she had said. "So what happens now?" he asked finally. Isabella took a deep breath. "Now I have to decide whether I meant what I said that night, whether I'm brave enough to follow through on my promise to marry someone who could move my soul with music." Roberto's eyes widened. "Isabella, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," she interrupted. "Not because I made a public promise, but because I meant it. Because I've been waiting my whole life for someone who understands music the way you do. Because I've never felt more connected to another person than I did when you were playing that simple song about finding your way home." Roberto stared at her in amazement. "But we barely know each other. How can you be sure?" Isabella smiled. "We know the most important thing about each other already. We know how we each use music to express what words can't say. Everything else, our favorite foods, our childhood memories, our dreams for the future, those are things we can learn together." She stood up from the piano bench and held out her hand to him. Roberto Morales, will you take a chance on building a life with someone who loves music as much as you do? Roberto looked at her outstretched hand like it was the most precious thing he had ever been offered. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and took it. Are you sure? He asked one more time. Are you absolutely sure this is what you want? Isabella squeezed his hand gently. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Roberto stood up, still holding her hand, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked truly hopeful. Then yes, he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. Yes, I would be honored to build a life with you. Isabella felt a joy she had never experienced before bubbling up inside her chest. This wasn't the dramatic romance she had seen in movies or read about in books. This was something quieter but deeper. This was finding someone who spoke her language. There's just one thing, Roberto said, suddenly looking nervous again. What? I should probably meet your parents before we start planning a wedding. And you should know that my family in Guatemala, they're going to want to video call with you at least 12 times before they decide if you're good enough for me. Isabella laughed, the sound echoing through the empty community center. Roberto, I can't wait to meet them all. Roberto grinned and squeezed her hand. My mother is going to cry when I tell her I'm marrying a piano teacher. She always said music was the universal language of love. Your mother sounds very wise. She is. She also makes the best tamales in 3 countries, and she's going to insist on cooking for our wedding. Isabella's smile grew wider. Our wedding? That has a nice sound to it. Roberto lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. Isabella, I promise you something. I may not be able to give you expensive jewelry or fancy vacations, but I will play music for you every day for the rest of our lives. And I will love you the way my sister taught me to love, completely, honestly, and without holding anything back. Isabella felt tears of happiness streaming down her face. That, she said, is exactly what I've been waiting to hear. As they stood together in the quiet community center, hands clasped and hearts full, Isabella realized that her challenge had worked exactly as intended, just not in the way she had expected. She hadn't found love through a grand public competition. She had found it in a quiet moment with a kind man who understood that the most beautiful music comes from the most honest places in the human heart. Outside, the city went about its evening business, unaware that something magical had just happened in an old building on 5th Street. Inside, 2 people who had been lonely for different reasons had discovered they could make beautiful music together. And in the silence that followed their promises to each other, Isabella could almost swear she heard the faint sound of applause from somewhere far away, as if Roberto's sister was letting them know she approved of the love story that was just beginning. Planning. A wedding should have been stressful, but for Isabella and Roberto, it felt more like composing a beautiful song together. Every decision they made seemed to fall into place naturally, as if they had been meant to create this celebration all along. The first challenge was deciding when to have the ceremony. Roberto needed time to arrange for his family in Guatemala to attend, which meant navigating complicated visa applications and saving money for plane tickets. Isabella's parents, once they recovered from their initial shock at her choice, threw themselves into helping with enthusiasm that surprised everyone. Isabella's mother, Maria, had been skeptical when Isabella first brought Roberto home for dinner. She had spent months worrying about her daughter's impossible standards, and part of her had wondered if Isabella would ever find anyone good enough. But when Roberto quiet, I helped clear the table after dinner and then sat down at their old upright piano to play a gentle lullaby he remembered from childhood. Maria's doubts melted away. Mija, she whispered to Isabella in the kitchen, that man looks at you like you hung the moon and stars. Isabella's father, Carlos, took a bit longer to warm up to Roberto. As a man who had worked his way up from janitor to supervisor at a local factory, Carlos understood the dignity of honest work. But he also worried about his daughter's financial security. It wasn't until Roberto spent an entire Saturday helping Carlos fix the plumbing in their basement, refusing payment and working with the kind of careful precision that came from years of taking care of other people's properties, that Carlos began to see what Isabella saw in this quiet man. The breakthrough came when Carlos made an offhand comment about wishing he could afford to fix the old piano that had been in their family for decades. Without being asked, Roberto showed up the following weekend with borrowed tools and spent 2 days carefully tuning and repairing the instrument. When he finished, the piano sounded better than it had in Isabella's entire lifetime. "You didn't have to do this," Carlos said, running his fingers over the newly polished keys. "Yes, I did," Roberto replied simply. "Isabella learned to love music on this piano. It deserves to sing beautifully for the next generation, too." From that moment, Carlos treated Roberto like the son he had never had. The second challenge was more complex: Roberto's immigration status. Isabella had done research and discovered that marrying a U.S. citizen would give Roberto a path to legal residency, but the process would be long and sometimes difficult. There would be interviews, paperwork, and waiting periods that could stretch on for months. "Are you sure you want to deal with all of this?" Roberto asked during one particularly frustrating evening of filling out forms. "It's going to be complicated for a long time." Isabella looked up from the stack of documents spread across her kitchen table. "Roberto, do you remember what your grandmother's song was about?" "Finding your way home no matter how far you've traveled." "Exactly. You're not asking me to deal with complications. You're asking me to help you find your way home, and your home is with me now." Roberto's eyes filled with tears, as they often did when Isabella said something that touched the deepest parts of his heart. "I love you," he said quietly. "I love you too. And love means we face complicated things together." While they worked through the legal processes, Roberto continued his job at the community center. But now, instead of working in invisible silence, he found himself part of the center's extended family. Mrs. Patterson had been thrilled to learn that her quiet night janitor was going to marry her beloved piano teacher. She immediately promoted Roberto to a day maintenance position with better pay and benefits. "We need someone who understands how precious this place is," she told him. "Someone who cares about more than just keeping it clean." Roberto proved to be exactly what the community center had needed. His gentle manner and musical background made him popular with the children who came for lessons. Soon he was helping with instrument maintenance, setting up for concerts, and even assisting with some of the beginner music classes. Isabella watched with joy as Roberto slowly emerged from the shell of invisibility that had protected him for so long. She saw him gain confidence as people began to appreciate not just his work ethic, but his ideas and insights. When he suggested starting a simple music appreciation program for adults, Mrs. Patterson immediately approved the budget. The program was Roberto's way of sharing what his sister had taught him about music being a universal language. Every Thursday evening, he would play simple songs from different cultures and tell the stories behind them. The classes were free and open to anyone, but they quickly became some of the most popular events at the center. Isabella loved watching Roberto teach these classes. He had a natural gift for helping people understand that music didn't have to be complicated to be meaningful. He taught elderly participants how to find the rhythm in songs they remembered from their youth. He showed teenagers how the music they loved on the radio connected to traditions that went back centuries. "Music is like friendship," Roberto would tell his classes. "It doesn't matter where it comes from or what language it speaks. If it touches your heart, it becomes part of your family." As their wedding day approached, both Isabella and Roberto began to feel the weight of the attention their story had attracted. The local media was still interested in covering the conclusion to Isabella's famous challenge. Social media influencers wanted to document their unconventional love story. Wedding vendors offered free services in exchange for publicity. Isabella found all of this attention overwhelming, but Roberto helped her see it differently. "Maybe this is good," he said one evening as they discussed whether to allow a reporter to interview them. "Maybe there are other people out there who feel invisible, like I used to feel. Maybe our story can help them believe that love can find anyone, anywhere." So they agreed to a few carefully selected interviews, using the platform to talk about the importance of seeing and valuing people who often go unnoticed in society. Isabella spoke about how the most beautiful music often comes from unexpected places. Roberto shared his belief that love grows strongest when people are willing to look beyond surface appearances to find the treasures hidden in human hearts. The response to these interviews surprised them both. Letters and emails poured in from people who had felt invisible in their own lives. A single mother working 3 jobs to support her children wrote to thank them for reminding her that her story mattered. An elderly man who had been widowed for 5 years said their love story had inspired him to start taking piano lessons again. 3 months before the wedding, Roberto received news that changed everything. His immigration attorney called to say that Roberto's case had been expedited due to his community involvement and the documentation of his contributions to local cultural programs. Instead of waiting years for his residency status to be resolved, he would have his green card in time for the wedding. Roberto cried when he got the news, not just from relief but from the realization that he truly had found his way home. The wedding itself was exactly what Isabella and Roberto had dreamed it would be. They held the ceremony at the community center, in the same main hall where Isabella had first made her famous challenge. The space was decorated simply with flowers, from local gardens and candles that cast warm light on the walls covered with photographs from the center's long history. Roberto, his family had all been able to get visas to attend. His mother, Rosa, was exactly as wonderful as he had described. A tiny woman with Roberto's gentle eyes and a laugh that could fill any room. She spent the week before the wedding teaching Isabella how to make traditional Guatemalan dishes and sharing stories about Roberto and his sister as children. He was always the quiet one, Rosa told Isabella as they worked together in Isabella's kitchen. But music made him brave. When he played guitar, you could see his whole soul. He still plays that way, Isabella replied. That's how I knew I loved him. Isabella's wedding dress was simple but elegant, chosen more for comfort than fashion since she planned to play piano during the reception. Roberto wore a suit that Isabella's father had insisted on buying for him, saying every man deserved to have at least one perfect suit for the most important day of his life. The ceremony was conducted by Father Martinez, the priest from the church Roberto had been attending since moving to the city. Father Martinez had grown fond of Roberto after he volunteered to help maintain the church's old organ, and he was delighted to perform the wedding for a couple who so clearly understood the spiritual power of music. When it came time for vows, Isabella and Roberto had decided to express their promises through music, rather than just words. Isabella played a piece she had composed for Roberto, a melody that wove together the song his grandmother had sung with themes that represented their shared future. Then Roberto played his grandmother's song on the guitar his mother had brought from Guatemala, the same instrument his sister had used to teach him. There wasn't a dry eye in the room as the music filled the space with love, hope, and the promise of beautiful harmonies to come. The reception was a joyful mixture of cultures and traditions. Rosa had insisted on preparing a feast of Guatemalan specialties, while Isabella's family contributed Italian dishes that had been passed down through generations. The community center's music students performed throughout the evening, creating a soundtrack of joy that perfectly captured the spirit of celebration. But the most memorable moment came near the end of the evening, when Roberto and Isabella sat down at the piano together to play a duet. They had been practicing for weeks, learning to blend their different musical styles into something new and beautiful. As they played together, their hands moving in harmony across the keys, Isabella realized that this was what she had been searching for all along. Not someone who could impress her with technical skill, but someone who could create music with her. Someone who understood that the most beautiful melodies came from two hearts beating in rhythm. The song they played was hopeful and complex, with moments of quiet tenderness and passages of joyful exuberance. It told the story of two people who had found each other against impossible odds, who had chosen love over fear, connection over loneliness. When they finished, the applause went on for a full minute, but Isabella barely heard it. She was too busy looking into Roberto's eyes, seeing her own happiness reflected there, knowing that they had just played the first song of what would be a lifetime of beautiful music together. 6 months later, Isabella and Roberto were still making music together every day. Roberto's English had improved dramatically, and he was considering taking classes to become a certified music teacher. Isabella had started incorporating traditional Latin American songs into her lesson plans, sharing Roberto's cultural heritage with her students. Their apartment above the music store downtown wasn't fancy, but it was filled with instruments, sheet music, and the sound of laughter. Roberto had kept his promise to play for Isabella every day, and she had discovered that falling asleep to the gentle sound of guitar music was better than any lullaby she had ever known. Sometimes people asked Isabella if she regretted her famous challenge, if she wished she had found love in a more conventional way, but Isabella always smiled and said that the best things in life rarely happened conventionally. I asked for someone who could move my soul with music, she would tell anyone who wanted to know. I got that and so much more. I got a partner, a best friend, and a reminder that love songs are always more beautiful when you sing them with someone else. And on quiet evenings at the community center, when Isabella taught her piano lessons and Roberto led his music appreciation classes, they would sometimes catch each other's eyes across the room and smile. They had found their way home to each other, and every day together was another verse in the most beautiful song either of them had ever been part of. The story of the woman who asked for music and found love became local legend. But for Isabella and Roberto, it was just the beginning of a symphony they would spend the rest of their lives composing together.